Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive into some fascinating tech. We talk a lot about the flashy stuff, the cutting-edge processors, the AI algorithms.
Yeah.
But today, I wanted to, frankly, kind of zoom in on an unsung hero. You know,
Go on.
something that's literally connecting so much of our modern world and something that your research suggests has a pretty substantial market.
Mm.
We're talking about press-fit connectors.
Oh,
I
interesting.
know. I know. It might not sound super exciting at first glance, but trust me, we're going to cover some really interesting stuff here.
I'm all ears.
So for anyone who might not be familiar, press-fit connectors are basically, they're a way of connecting electronic components without the need for soldering.
Right. So it's all mechanical.
Exactly. No heat, no messy solder, just a really, really precise, tight fit.
Hmm.
And the sources you dug up indicate this isn't some niche technology. It's a global market with some pretty impressive numbers attached to it.
Yeah, the projections are pretty eye-opening, actually.
So our mission in this deep dive is to, well, first of all, understand what's driving this market, where it's headed, and why anyone who's following the evolution of electronics should care.
Sounds good.
So let's start with the big picture. What kind of scale are we talking about here?
Well, by 2025, the global market for press-fit connectors is expected to hit a whopping 10,240 million US dollars.
$10 billion.
That's right. And by 2033, that number is projected to jump even higher to 15,596.4 million.
Wow. Okay, so clearly we're talking about a significant market here.
Definitely not a niche market.
Not at all. And that 2033 projection represents a compound annual growth rate, a CAGR, of 5.40%. So we're not just talking about a big market, it's a growing market.
Absolutely. Consistent growth like that really indicates a technology that's mature and well-established, but also one that's continuing to find new applications.
Okay, so let's unpack some of those drivers a bit. What are the key factors that are fueling this demand for press-fit connectors?
Well, I'd say one of the primary drivers is the increasing demand for connections that just offer really exceptional reliability, and particularly those that don't rely on solder joints. You see, while soldering is still a very common technique, those joints can sometimes be a weak point.
Oh, right.
They can be susceptible to things like vibration or extreme temperatures. And press fit connectors, by kind of creating this really strong mechanical connection, often just provide a much more durable, stable solution.
I see. So it's about resilience,
Yeah,
especially in demanding situations.
exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. And the other big factor that kept popping up in your sources was the automotive industry.
Yeah, that's a huge driver.
As cars become more and more electronic, it seems like they need more and more of these reliable connections.
Right. Especially with the shift towards electric vehicles,
EVs.
EVs, they're just packed with all these high power, high voltage systems.
Oh, yeah.
And so those systems absolutely require connections that you can just totally depend on.
Yeah. So press-fit technology is stepping in to fill that need.
Precisely. Think about the battery management system in an EV or the power inverters. Those need connections that won't fail under pressure.
Okay, so a significant and growing global market driven by both a need for really robust connections and this electric vehicle revolution that we're in the middle of.
Right.
Now, I'm curious about how this demand is distributed geographically, and it looks like from your research that North America currently holds the biggest chunk of this market.
Yeah, that's right. In 2025, they're expected to account for over 37% of the global market, which translates to a value of about $3,788.8 million.
Okay, so a big slice of the pie. But their projected growth rate is a little more modest, right?
Yeah, their CAGR from 2025 to 2033 is about 4.2%. So solid growth, but other regions are anticipated to grow a little faster.
Interesting. So a dominant position for now, but not necessarily the most explosive growth. Now, within North America, the U.S. market seems to be the main driver, right?
Yeah, the United States is projected to represent about $2,989.36 million of the North American market in 2025, with a CAGR of about 4%.
Okay. And what's fueling that growth specifically in the U.S.?
Well, one factor is the expansion of smart manufacturing, the whole Industry 4.0 thing.
Right.
And then the other is the increasing levels of automation we're seeing, especially within the automotive industry.
Makes sense. Both of those trends rely heavily on having this reliable, robust network of connections.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about Canada and Mexico? How do they fit into the North American picture?
Well, Canada's market is estimated to be about $454.66 million dollars in 2025.
Okay.
And they actually have a slightly higher projected CAGR at about 5%.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, it seems to be connected to Canada's increasing adoption of electric and hybrid vehicles.
Ah, so those government incentives for EVs and HEVs are really starting to impact the market.
Yeah, it seems so. More EVs on the road equals a greater need for those specialized connectors in those vehicles.
Makes sense. And Mexico.
Mexico's market size is estimated to be about $344.78 million dollars in 2025,
Okay.
with a CAGR of about 4.7%.
So still healthy growth.
Yeah, but it looks like their growth is tied to different factors, potentially some of their specific strengths in electronics and automotive manufacturing.
Okay, so North America is a strong player, with the U.S. leading the charge for now. But let's hop across the pond. Europe also seems to be a major market for these connectors.
It is. Europe holds the second largest market share, actually.
Really?
Yeah, it's over 29% of the global revenue with a total market size of about $2,969.6 million dollars in 2025.
Wow, pretty close to North America.
Yeah, and their projected CAGR is the same as North America's at 4.2%.
Interesting. So kind of neck and neck in terms of overall growth.
Mm.
But within Europe, are there specific countries that are really driving this demand?
Well, the UK and Germany are the standout markets.
Yeah, makes sense.
The UK's market is expected to reach about $498.9 million dollars in 2025 with a CAGR of 5%.
Okay. And what's fueling their growth?
Well, they've got a few things going for them. The expansion of 5G network infrastructure is a big one.
Right, of course, all that data needs to move somewhere.
Exactly. And they also have a growing cloud computing sector and they're really invested in AI, so there's all these data centers popping up.
Yeah.
And then on top of all that, they have a strong presence in both automotive and aerospace electronics. So lots of need for reliable connections there too.
So it's this combination of digital infrastructure and those more traditional industries.
Yeah, it's a good mix.
What about Germany? I mean, they're always a powerhouse when it comes to
Yeah.
industrial technology.
Absolutely. Germany's market is estimated to be around $587.98 million dollars in 2025.
Hmm.
And they've got a CAGR of 4.4%.
Solid. And what are some of the specific applications driving demand there?
Well, given their leadership in the automotive industry, that's a big one,
Yeah.
especially with electric vehicles and all the advanced driver assistance systems.
Right.
But they're also, really leading the charge in Industry 4.0, all that smart manufacturing, automation, and robotics.
So they're going to need a lot of connectors to keep all those systems running smoothly.
For sure.
Okay. And just to round out our European tour, what about the rest of the continent? Any other markets worth mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few countries that contribute.
Okay.
Russia has a pretty large market. It's around $460.29 million, although their KGR is a bit lower at 3.2%. France and Italy are also significant players, with markets around 273.2 and 255.39 million, respectively.
Mm.
And then, of course, you've got Spain, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland,
Right.
even Luxembourg,
Yeah.
and then all the rest of Europe combined. All those markets have their own unique dynamics and growth trajectories.
Right. Reflecting their specific economies and tech sectors.
Yeah.
Okay, so Europe's a solid number 2. Now let's shift gears and talk about the region with the highest projected growth, Asia Pacific.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, wait on me.
So in 2025, APAC is expected to represent about 24% of the global market,
Okay.
which is a pretty significant chunk already. Their market size is about $2,457.6 million.
Okay, and what about that growth rate?
Well, their projected CAGR from 2025 to 2033 is a whopping 8.2%.
8.2%.
Yeah, that's significantly higher than North America and Europe.
Wow, that's huge. What's driving that kind of growth?
A lot of factors, really, but I think the main one is their dominance in manufacturing, especially in consumer electronics and semiconductor.
Right. I mean, countries like China, Japan, South Korea, they're producing a massive amount of electronics.
Exactly. Smartphones, laptops, you name it. All those devices need those high-density miniaturized connections.
Right.
And then on top of that, you have the really fast rollout of 5G networks across the region. and the just explosion of cloud computing,
Mhm.
all that means there's a huge demand for press-fit connectors in all those networking and telecommunication systems too.
So it's this combination of just sheer volume of electronics being produced
Yeah,
and the need for more robust and higher speed connections to support all those new technologies.
precisely.
Let's zoom in on a couple of those key markets. China obviously has to be a major player.
Oh yeah, China's market is massive.
What are we talking about numbers-wise?
It's estimated to be around $1,032.19 million in 2025, with a CAGR of 7.7%.
Wow, that's a lot of connectors.
Yeah.
And what are the main factors driving their market?
Well, their consumer electronics industry is obviously a huge factor. They're making a lot of the world's smartphones and other devices,
Right.
and they're, also becoming increasingly sophisticated in their semiconductor manufacturing.
Hmm.
And then you have their really ambitious rollout of 5G infrastructure. That's nationwide.
Okay, so lots of demand for connections across a bunch of different sectors.
Yeah, pretty much.
What about South Korea? They're another tech powerhouse.
Yeah, absolutely. Their market is a little smaller than China's. It's estimated to be about $294.91 million in 2025,
Okay.
but they have a strong CAGR of 7.3%.
Okay, so what are they specializing in?
Well, they're a global leader in 5G technology, and they're really investing in developing all these AI-driven data centers. So that's creating a huge demand for, those high-performance connectors.
Hmm.
And then, of course, they also have a thriving semiconductor industry themselves. Samsung and LG are major players there,
Oh, right, of course.
and their electric vehicle market is also expanding rapidly. So, that's adding to the demand too.
So really, it's a combination of factors, all playing into their need for these connectors.
Definitely.
Okay, and what about India? We've been hearing a lot about their economic growth.
Yeah, well, India is actually projected to have the highest AGR in the entire APAC region. It's a remarkable 10.1%.
10.1%. Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, it really is. Their market is estimated to be around $245.6 million in 2025, and it's just poised to grow really, really rapidly.
Okay, so what's fueling that incredible growth?
Well, it's partly their expanding manufacturing capabilities and partly just this increasing adoption of technology across all sectors of their economy.
So it's kind of this rising tide lifting all boats
Hmm.
situation.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it.
Okay. And just to round out our quick tour of APAC, what about Japan, Australia, some of the other key markets?
So Japan has a pretty substantial market. It's around $339.15 million with a KGR of 6.7%.
Okay.
Australia's market is smaller, but they've got a strong KGR of 7.5%. Singapore, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia as a whole, they're all showing really healthy growth too.
So a lot of variation within the region, but overall a very dynamic and growing market.
Definitely.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to some other parts of the world. South America, for example, seems to have a decent growth rate.
Yeah, South America holds a little over 4% of the global market share,
Okay.
with a projected market size of about $389.12 million in 2025 and a CAGR of 5.7%.
Okay, so respectable growth. And which countries are kind of leading the way there?
Brazil is the biggest market in South America.
Okay.
It's estimated to be around $166.54 million in 2025, with a KGR of 6.3%.
Okay, and what are the big drivers for them?
Well, they're seeing a lot of growth in industrial automation, smart manufacturing,
Right.
and also in their telecommunications infrastructure, investing in things like fiber optics and 5G.
Makes sense. And what about Argentina?
So Argentina has a market of about $65.37 million and a GR of 6.6%.
Okay, so what are their main areas of focus?
Well, their automotive sector is one driver,
Hmm.
and they're also really focusing on renewable energy, so that requires a lot of advanced electronics and connections.
Right, right. And are there any other notable markets in South America?
Yeah, I mean, Colombia, Peru, and Chile are all contributing to the regional growth.
Okay, so steady progress, although maybe not quite as explosive as APAC. Now, what about the Middle East?
Okay, so the Middle East holds about 4% of the global market share, with a market size of about $409.6 million in 2025
Okay.
and a projected CKGR of 5.9%.
Okay, so similar to South America.
Yeah.
And what's driving their growth?
It's interesting, actually. A lot of it seems to be government initiatives, things like, smart city development,
Hmm.
and this push for digital transformation across a lot of industries.
Right.
And then also, of course, the expansion of high-speed internet connectivity.
So kind of this top-down approach to modernizing their infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
And are there any countries in particular that are leading this charge?
Well, Saudi Arabia is a big one. Their market is about $144.18 million, with a CAGR of 6.2%.
Okay.
The UAE is also significant. It's around $84.38 million, with a slightly higher CAGR of 6.4%.
Interesting. And what about Turkey? I know they've been making a push to develop their tech sector.
Yeah, Turkey has a market of about $32.7 million, and they have the highest CAGR in the region at 6.5%. And a lot of their growth is being driven by their automotive and defense electronics industries.
So kind of those more specialized sectors.
Okay.
Okay. And finally, let's touch on Africa. It looks like they currently have the smallest market share.
Yeah, Africa's market is around $225.28 million in 2025, which represents about 2.2% of the global market.
Okay, but they still have a growth trajectory, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Their projected CAGR is 5.1%.
Okay, and what's driving their growth?
It's mostly tied to the expansion of telecommunications infrastructure and all the electrification projects that are happening across the continent. South Africa and Nigeria are the key markets there, with investments in broadband networks, mobile communications, and things like power distribution systems.
Okay, so lots of opportunity for growth as they build out their infrastructure.
Mhm.
Okay, we've taken a pretty extensive tour of the global landscape for press fit connectors.
We have.
Now let's actually dive into the technology itself. Your research mentioned two main types of these connectors: solid press-in and compliant press-in.
Right.
What's the core difference between these two types, and what are their typical applications?
Well, the main difference really comes down to the design of the pin, the part that's actually getting pressed into the hole on the circuit board.
Okay.
Solid press-in connectors, they use a rigid pin,
Mm.
often with a really sharp edge or a knurled surface. And this is designed to create this incredibly tight interference fit, kind of like if you try to jam a slightly oversized peg into a hole.
I see. So it's like forcing it in there to make that super strong connection.
Exactly.
Okay. What about the compliant press-in connectors?
Well, compliant press-in connectors use a more flexible, kind of elastic pin design. So instead of that super tight fit, these pins are engineered to actually deform a little bit when you insert them.
So they bend a little?
Yeah, just slightly.
Right.
And this allows for a lower insertion force, which can be really important when you're dealing with delicate circuit boards.
Okay.
You don't want to crack the board.
Makes sense. So less force, but still a reliable connection.
Right. And because they deform, they can still make good contact, even if the hole in the board is a little bit off in terms of size.
Okay. So that's a good advantage for those compliant connectors.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, in terms of their applications, where are each of these types typically used?
Well, your research suggests that solid press-in connectors are probably going to continue to be the dominant type just because of their really incredible reliability and durability. That super tight, rigid connection, it just provides excellent mechanical strength, and it's really stable over the long term.
Okay. So it can handle a lot of stress.
Exactly. So they're ideal for, situations where you might have a lot of vibration or extreme temperatures or just a harsh environment.
Okay. What are some examples of those kinds of applications?
Well, you see them a lot in automotive electronics
Right.
and also aerospace systems, industrial automation equipment, telecommunications infrastructure, basically anything where you absolutely cannot afford for a connection to fail.
Right. Makes sense. You don't want your airplane falling apart mid-flight.
Exactly.
Okay. What about those compliant press-in connectors? You mentioned that they were seeing rapid growth. Why is that?
Well, they have a few advantages. One is cost. They're typically cheaper to manufacture.
Okay.
And they also offer more flexibility in the assembly process. And as I mentioned, they require a much lower insertion force, which makes them less likely to damage those delicate circuit boards.
Right.
And, as electronic devices get smaller and smaller and more densely packed with components, that lower insertion force becomes even more important.
Okay. So they're kind of the go-to for those smaller, more delicate devices.
Yeah, exactly. They're really well suited for high volume electronics manufacturing and all those miniaturized systems where cost efficiency and ease of assembly are really important.
Okay, so it sounds like solid press-in for those demanding high reliability applications and compliant press-in for more general high volume electronics.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary.
Now, the research also breaks down the market by specific applications. And as we've already touched on, the automotive sector is the biggest user of these connectors.
It is, and that's really being driven by the shift towards electric vehicles, as we discussed.
Right.
All those EVs and HEVs, they need all these sophisticated electronics to manage the battery, control the motor, all that stuff.
Mhm.
And those systems require, really reliable connections.
Okay, so it's not just about the connectors themselves, it's about how they fit into these larger systems. Okay, and the other major application that was highlighted was data communication, which is also the fastest growing segment.
Yeah, that's right. All that growth in cloud computing, 5G networks, and AI, it's just creating a massive demand for high-speed data communication infrastructure.
Makes sense.
And that means all those routers, switches, fiber optic transceivers, all that equipment needs to handle huge amounts of data with minimal signal loss.
Right.
And press-fit connectors are really good at that.
So cars and the internet, two of the most fundamental parts of modern life, both relying heavily on this connector technology.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the bigger picture. What are the forces that are really propelling this market forward? What are some of the potential challenges, and what are the overall trends that we're seeing?
Okay, so we've already talked about some of the key drivers, that need for reliability, the growth in automotive electronics, all that.
Right.
But another important factor is just, advancements in PCB manufacturing, printed circuit board manufacturing.
Okay.
They're getting more and more sophisticated. And there's this constant trend towards miniaturization.
So the connectors have to keep up with those advancements.
Absolutely. Press-fit technology is really well suited for those smaller, more intricate designs.
Okay. Now, on the flip side, are there any challenges, any roadblocks that might hinder the adoption of this technology?
Yeah, there are a couple things to consider. One is the initial cost.
Okay.
Implementing press-fit technology can be more expensive upfront.
Hmm.
You need specialized tooling and equipment for the insertion process.
Right. So there's that barrier to entry for some manufacturers.
Yeah, it can be a factor. And then the other thing is that the insertion and sometimes the extraction process, it can be a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
You often need precision machinery to make sure the connections are made correctly and that you don't damage anything.
Right. So it requires a higher level of precision.
Exactly.
Okay. So there are some challenges to consider. Now, looking ahead, what are some of the key trends that you see shaping the future of this market? We've talked about the impact of EVs and 5G, but are there any other notable trends emerging?
Well, I think the increasing integration of press-fit connectors, specifically within electric vehicles, is going to be huge. I mean, as EV production just keeps ramping up globally, the demand for these really reliable connections in all those key systems, like the battery packs, the power electronics, the motor control units, it's just going to keep growing.
Okay, so more EVs equals more demand for connectors.
Pretty much. And then, on the data side, the rollout of 5G infrastructure and the just constant expansion of telecommunications networks, that's going to continue to drive the demand for press-fit connectors in that sector, too.
So it's kind of a two-pronged growth trajectory. Okay, so lots of potential for the future. Finally, let's talk about the companies that are actually making all these connectors.
Right.
It sounds like there's a mix of big international players and smaller, more specialized companies.
Yeah, that's right. It's a pretty competitive market. There are a lot of established companies out there, both global and regional.
Okay.
And they're all competing on things like, the variety of products they offer, the strength of their distribution networks, their ability to, innovate and come up with new connector technologies.
So who are some of the major players, the names that kind of keep popping up?
Well, some of the key companies that your research highlighted are TE Connectivity,
Okay.
Amphenol,
Mm.
Fujitsu,
Okay.
RNI International,
Hmm.
Radial,
Okay.
Harding,
Hmm.
Japan Aviation Electronics Industry Limited, that's a mouthful,
Yeah.
JST Manufacturing Company,
Okay.
Interplex,
Yeah.
Samtec,
Okay.
and Worth Electronic.
So quite a few companies vying for a piece of that market.
Yeah, there's definitely no shortage of competition.
It sounds like innovation is still a big part of this industry. Your research mentioned a new product from JST Manufacturing.
Yeah, in January of 2023, they introduced the HVM connector,
Okay.
which is a really tiny connector designed for high voltage applications, specifically in the automotive industry.
Hmm.
And that really shows you, the trend towards miniaturization
Right.
and the fact that these companies are constantly developing new solutions to meet the needs of these, emerging technologies like EVs.
So even in a field like connector technology, there's still a lot of room for innovation.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Let's wrap things up with a quick recap. What are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Okay, so I think the big things to remember are, the sheer size of the press fit connector market. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry that's only going to continue to grow.
Right.
And that growth is happening all over the world, but some regions, like Asia Pacific, are really seeing explosive growth.
Hmm.
And then in terms of applications, it's clear that the automotive and data communications sectors are the main drivers.
Right.
All those EVs and all those high-speed networks, they all rely on these connectors.
Makes sense.
And finally, I think it's important to understand that there isn't just one type of press fit connector.
Right.
You've got those solid press-in connectors, which are all about reliability.
Hmm.
And then you've got the compliant press-in connectors, which offer more cost-effectiveness and flexibility for different kinds of applications.
Okay, so lots to consider when choosing the right connector for the job.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it.